A Trump impeachment seems more likely than ever, with a new set of polls out this week, including the brand new NPR PBS NewsHour Marist Poll. This time on Poll Hub, we're going to dig in to see which numbers are moving and which are not, and maybe more important, which parts of the electorate are changing. CNN poll guru and big friend of Poll Hub, Harry Enten, will join to discuss, so let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
So 3 weeks in a row, we're talking about impeachment. And as we were just talking about off camera, well, it's not camera, off mic. Right. Impeachment means different things to different people. So impeachment is not the president being removed from office. That's conviction in the Senate. And in the impeachment involves the impeachment process. Right now, the impeachment process hasn't been voted on by the House. There's an inquiry that is underway. There's a lot of different terminology here. But at the end of the day, there's been a series of polls this week, and we have a brand new one out that show that the American people seem to be moving a little bit towards the direction of being in favor of some part of this process moving forward.
Yeah, and I think
is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I think what we clearly divided it up in our poll between the three stages, the triple threat, if you will, facing Donald Trump. And one is the inquiry. The other is a vote on impeachment to officially charge him. And the third would be going to the Senate for the removal from office. And those have very different numbers.
So what do we find?
In the question of the inquiry, that's the one that we have a trend on, and that's the one we saw a significant movement among independents, a 19-point swing, so that you now have a majority saying that they would like to see this inquiry.
A majority of independents joining
and actually,
a very large majority of
a
Democrats.
majority of Americans approve of the House's impeachment inquiry. 43% disapprove. And I think what was somewhat surprising was the fact that we've only 2 weeks really have transpired between our trend dots that we have on this line. But what we did see 2 weeks ago was that Americans really were more divided on the inquiry, 49 to 46. So in polling terms, that's a divide that's statistically within the margin of error. And so we were looking at as kind of a net +3, meaning that 3 points on the side of the impeachment inquiry, moving ahead, and now that difference is a net +9. So it's 52% of Americans, as Lee pointed out, a majority, including a majority of independents, now want the inquiry to move forward.
And that's, I think, the biggest change that we've seen. And then on the other question, it's the question of should the House formally charge him with impeachment, and should the Senate remove him? We're seeing a pretty much even split on those.
Well, there's a long way also to go. I mean, that's way down the road, even at the lightning speed that all this craziness works.
I'll tell you, on those two parts of it, the last two parts, I was struck by how close the numbers were to the inquiry, because we haven't had the debate yet in the House, and we haven't had the debate, the trial in the Senate, and yet you have 52% wanting the inquiry. I believe it was 49 want the House to vote for impeachment, and 48% want to convict. So in a sense, the Democrats and Republicans are really locked in, and I think the independents on the first part of that have tipped that over to a majority. And that's sort of where we are right now.
Well, some of the other things that have changed, too, is that Americans are somewhat more likely to also be thinking of the inquiry as a serious matter. When we first asked this, when the issue just was bubbling up. Again, it was partisanship. Democrats, thought that there should be an inquiry. Republicans thought that there shouldn't be because it was just politics. But now we're seeing a little bit more of a shift. Again, it's because of these independents. People considering the fact that this is a serious matter. In fact, we put two extremes in our question. We said, do you think it's a very serious matter, or do you think it's just politics? And so we see somewhat of a movement towards it being a serious matter, particularly among people who are following the impeachment issues in the news. And those people tend to be more partisan, both Democrat and Republican.
One thing that strikes me as a bit of a canary in the coal mine if you're in the Trump White House is that where these numbers are moving, and they're moving, in some ways somewhat significant amounts, but they still are, pretty closely divided. The country's pretty closely divided. We asked the question, based on what you know at this point, do you think Donald Trump's phone call with the president of Ukraine was mostly serving the best interest of the American public or the best interest of Trump's reelection campaign? And what stands out here is there's not much of a divide here. 59% of Americans think it was to serve his reelection. And since the phone call is the central focus of this impeachment inquiry and process, that strikes me as a very worrisome sign, is that if I'm in the Trump White House, sure, is that the last 2 weeks of messaging that the call was perfect and beautiful and there's no problem, and even Republicans standing there, there was nothing in the call. 59-31 Americans and also, don't really buy that.
Related to that is 68% tell us in this NPR PBS Marist poll that it's unacceptable for a president to entice a foreign leader to do what this rival attack.
Right, another 9 points higher than the question.
And
about
actually,
who
what's interesting is we talk about the partisanship, but on that particular question, whether it's actually acceptable for a president to ask a foreign leader to help investigate a political rival, 40% of Republicans actually think it's unacceptable.
So just a pushback from if I'm a Republican here and I'm doing talking points, I would say, well, but that's a loaded question because you're assuming that that's what he was doing. And he didn't do that. He, in fact, was asking for them to look at, in their country, at corruption.
Actually, the question we asked was whether, really, it talked about whether talking about and mentioning a potential rival, and we named the rival, former Vice President Joe Biden, and we asked if it was really about whether he could mention him on the call to this leader. So we asked it in a rather innocuous way, trying not to place or characterize either the motivation or the what the actual discussion was, other than what we have read in the so-called transcript of the call.
Or what the president has said.
Which reinforces the point, I think, that this is the central part of this impeachment process, is this call. It is still really just about this call. And on the critical issues of what the call is, what it means, what was done, Americans aren't buying the Trump.
But that's also that is the strategy for the Democrats. I mean, Speaker Pelosi has been very clear that she wanted to have a narrow interpretation of what the impeachment inquiry would deal with.
And our poll supports her political instincts on that.
Absolutely.
Well, I think in part this is, there has been articles to the effect that the Trump White House has been a little slow in getting their case together. I think they're moving in that direction now. But for example, when we asked about whether the whistleblower, whether the name should be revealed or protected, well, when you say it should be revealed, you're really flying in the face of public opinion. So 59% think the whistleblower should be protected. So including, I believe it's 34% of Republicans. So if you're the White House, that's not the tree you want to climb.
Is there good news in here?
Yes, there was one I thought was very interesting and far
good news for the Trump White House.
Yes,
sorry, I didn't mean to leave that.
But I think it's something we're going to hear a lot more about. We asked people, well, in face of all this, basically, do you want this controversy resolved through the impeachment process or through the ballot box, meaning in 2020? Answer, ballot box 58, impeachment process 37. So if it starts looking, for lack of a term, mungy, that you're really getting caught.
Looking what?
in the quicksand.
Mungy?
Mungy. It's like
It's a survey term.
yes. It's
Okay.
not clear as it may have been when it started.
Okay.
When Pelosi said, we're going to go on this issue. If it starts looking not clear and it starts getting a little difficult for the Democrats to traverse the issue, this is a problem for them.
Is this one we're going to
potentially.
track for trend?
Yes.
'Cause that seems
Absolutely.
like a
And
good one.
it's interesting because yes, people don't want to necessarily go down this road, at least in terms of a process. They're concerned about the fact that the Congress may then not continue to work on other issues. They are certainly also think that it'll give the opposing party an upper hand. So if you're a Democrat, you think this is going to help
The Republicans.
the Republicans, and if you're a Republican, you think this is going to help the Democrats.
And I imagine that at least at some point there is the natural human aversion to want to avoid conflict, and there's no bigger conflict in constitutional democracy than impeachment.
So let's now bring in Harry Enten, our good friend. Harry is the senior writer and analyst for CNN. He's in Poughkeepsie right here, live and from Poughkeepsie. He's going to be talking to our class as he's done before on previous occasions. So we really appreciate you coming up here, Harry. And we're going to get some insights now on the political universe, and then you get to meet some students in a little bit. Thanks for coming up.
Live and in living color. NBC. Now, look, pleasure to be here as always. Shalom to y'all, as we like to say down south in southern New York. And I think that we'll all have a pleasant time together, and then we'll learn something new as the students learn. We're all always learning, aren't we?
We're all in this together. So
yeah, unfortunately, mostly by experience. I thought, I could just learn from others. That might be a little easier. But no, I think it's this one day at a time thing.
all right, so we're going through a whole beginnings, really, of an impeachment cycle. And we're all polling it, and, CNN has, Marist has, and everybody else who, is polling is doing it. Is there anything surprising you about the numbers before we talk about some methods, which I wanted to get to also? But is there anything surprising about what you're seeing in any of these numbers, sir?
I don't know if there's anything surprising. What I will say that's so interesting to me is it's very clear that it didn't take very long for the impeachment inquiry numbers to start looking like the president's own approval rating, right? So that if you approve of the job the president's doing, you're most likely to disapprove of the inquiry. If you disapprove of the president's job, you're most likely to approve of the inquiry. And there was no guarantee that was going to be the case, right? Because when they polled the inquiry back in August, I believe Monmouth University did, the split was actually 41% thought it was a good idea, 51% said it was a bad idea, and then literally overnight, the plurality position became that it was a good idea, and then as we've gotten a little bit deeper into this so-called impeachment cycle, it's become that plurality has turned to a majority.
And that became, on that point, I know our friend Mark Murray at NBC noted, I think over the weekend, that 53 or 54% are now pretty much not in Trump's corner. And then he pointed out that's exactly what happened in November of 2016 when Trump got 46 and 54 were not in his corner. So it is the same kind of number that we're seeing again.
Well, it's become, I think, very partisan. I mean, it's very polarized, and you're right, Harry. I think in terms of the fact that as soon as the speaker talked about going forward with the inquiry, everybody just really lined up on either side. But, I heard you guys, before we got all of this started, talking a little bit about how this compares to past impeachments. One of you, I know, lived through it.
Yes, thanks.
And the other studied it very seriously historically. And I'm not sure who has the better facts, but I'm going to kind of lean towards Harry.
Yes.
But anyway, I'd like you guys to talk a little bit about, some of the differences that we're seeing.
First of all, when said we were just we were kibitzing, okay? And I'm not going to make you say that, okay? But we were kibitzing, okay? And so, Harry, let's talk a little bit about. We've had a few impeachments.
We've had a few. I've, in fact, lived through one, not the other. I've lived through Mr. Clinton's impeachment back in the late 90s, and I had no idea what the hell was going on back then. And good thing I shouldn't have known, given my age at the time. And then, obviously, there was the impeachment of Nixon, or the try to impeach him, and got out before he was actually impeached back in 73, 74. And look, if you look back, I think what's so interesting is people assume, without looking at anything, you just say, oh, well, it was a clear case from start to finish, right? Nixon was going down. Everyone knew he was going down, and there was no big thing that was going on. That's not the case at all. If you were to look at the impeach and remove question, specifically regarding Nixon, at this particular point in, say, the impeachment inquiry period, Trump's numbers are actually, the percentage who say they want to impeach and remove him are higher than they were for Nixon back then. It took time to build the case against him. And once it did, it happened very, very quickly over the late spring and early summer of 1974. But we're way ahead of that pace right now. Whether or not we can keep pace, who really knows?
Well, we live in a different speed zone anyway. But talk a little bit about, you were mentioning before we were on the program about, when the Judiciary Committee started, when the impeachment, because I think people have perhaps a distorted view of that time that it took and how quickly it's all happening now.
Well, yeah, you mentioned, Lee, that you felt like it took forever.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was like every 3 or 4 weeks, another little thing would happen. And then until the hearings, and then, why don't you check the tapes, which I guess was the big line at the time. But
right. I mean, look, obviously the Watergate break-in took place in 72. And then, to be perfectly frank, if what you essentially had was it took until October of 73 to even have the real hints of an impeachment inquiry. That was when the Judiciary Committee decided to form one. And it wasn't until February of 74 that the entire House ratified that. And it wasn't until May of 74 in which you had the hearings that became so infamous. And so it took, some time to develop. And now keep in mind, they started the impeachment inquiry in late September of 2019 this time around, right? We're just into it. There's still plenty of time to go, plenty of facts to be uncovered. And I think what's going to be interesting to see is whether or not the numbers move as more facts become uncovered.
Yeah.
So does this help or hurt the Democrats?
Look, I think that there were a lot of people who argued beforehand, before all this started, oh, Trump wants to be impeached. Oh, this is going to be glorious because it shows a Democratic overreach. But over the last, 72 hours or so, there have been a number of polls that have come out. They've asked, do you approve of the job that Trump is doing on impeachment? The impeachment inquiry? Do you approve of the job congressional Republicans are doing on the impeachment inquiry? Do you approve of the job congressional Democrats are doing on the impeachment inquiry? And what do we see? We see overwhelming net negative numbers for congressional Republicans and for Trump, and we actually see a slightly net positive approval rating for congressional Democrats on how they're approving it. So, in my opinion, I haven't seen the president's overall approval number, at least in terms of the average of polls, move. And he is still down by a significant margin versus his potential Democratic rivals heading into 2020. Obviously, things can shift. Maybe there will be perceived Democratic overreach. But at this point, simply put, there hasn't been, at least in the minds of the public.
Yeah, I know the Fox poll, which is, we always like to say, a real scientific poll. They do good work at Fox on their poll, to the chagrin of the president, who it doesn't make that difference between Fox News and Fox Poll. But their numbers showed, I think, probably even a bigger crack in the base of the president's standing than anybody else has. We saw some of it. We saw some white evangelical Christians moving a little bit, but nothing dramatic. The base is still largely intact.
Yes.
That would be the big indicator of major problems.
I think that's exactly right. If you look across an average of polls, 11% of Republicans say they want to impeach or remove the president. That's up slightly from earlier polls, but not significantly. 16%, which is a somewhat larger number, approve of the impeachment inquiry. But I think that's the real question going forward, right? Is there going to be some real cracks in the president's base? And the reason that's so important is because unlike 74, where Democrats had a clear House majority and a clear Senate majority, this time around, the Senate is controlled by Republicans, and it's, not a tiny majority, but it's not a huge one, but it's, 53 seats. You're going to have to get a lot of Republicans on board in order to actually remove Trump. And given where the numbers are right now, that does not.
There's no incentive.
How is the Republican Party different now than it was then.
Yeah, I think that this is also a rather key point, and that is if you look at the 7 House members on the Judiciary Committee who voted for at least one of the articles of impeachment back in '74, they were overwhelmingly moderate. In fact, at least according to one measure, the median member of that group of 7 was more moderate than any House Republican is today. Take that in for a moment. That party has shifted significantly. It used to be, if you look at self-identified Republicans in the electorate, about 50% considered themselves moderate or liberal, say about 40% considered themselves somewhat conservative, and only about 10% considered themselves very conservative. You flip forward to today, what do you essentially see? You see about a 1/3 split across the board. The moderate liberal bloc has been cut basically by 20 points. The very conservative bloc has gone up by more than 20 points, and the somewhat conservatives have also come a little bit back. But that's the question. This very conservative group in which, get this, in our last CNN poll, only 1% wanted the president impeached or removed, those very conservative Republicans. Unless that group moves, it's very difficult for the president to be truly in trouble.
So, yeah, the moderate liberal Republicans of the early 1970s are actually called Democrats, I think, now, right? And so what you're saying is that Goldwater is now mainstream Republican?
I would say that some form of that certainly is the case, is that Goldwater, he said, I'm going to go on so long enough that essentially my position will become the liberal position. And in some cases it has, certainly on certain social issues. But yeah, that's exactly right. Look, we've seen both parties go towards the polls. And on Republicans, that's certainly true. And that gives this president a position of power that, say, Richard Nixon did not have in 1974.
Yeah, and you have to always remember, Richard Nixon is the Environmental Protection Agency. He proposed income redistribution.
He went to China.
He went to China. These are things
Opened up China.
At the time were very much not in line with anything that we would understand to be the case since. Let me ask you a little bit. I didn't see you bring your crystal ball with you, but we're going to require you.
I believe that's down in Charlottesville, Virginia. I believe it might belong to a certain professor down there. I'm not sure.
Well, but he is. Chris Cuomo does call him the Wizard of Oz.
The Wizard of Oz.
So
great,
he's got to have some tricks
great line
up his sleeve.
Yeah. So
It's a
okay,
quarter.
Joe Biden, is mentioned in a lot of this stuff, obviously now,
Yeah.
and we're not in a neutral time. He came out for the impeachment. 85% of Democrats agree with him. So if anything, it was good politics. But what is the long-term implication of this on Biden? Because he's now in the mix. He's in the discussion.
I think there's a real question about that, and I think it really boils down to whether or not you believe what the president is selling you. And that is, if you believe what the president's selling you, and that Joe Biden's quote-unquote corrupt, then it's very bad news for him. It could also be bad news if you're of the belief you're a Democrat, you want to get the most electable candidate up there, and you believe that this makes Joe Biden less electable. But what we also know, according to the polls so far, is that it really hasn't dented Biden among non-Democratic voters. We saw that in NBC Wall Street Journal poll, where his net favorability, I think, actually climbed 3 points. We've seen that in general election polls for the most part, where Biden continues to run well ahead of Donald Trump, at least in a hypothetical general election matchup. As long as those are the case, this is not the thing that's going to bring Biden down. You could make the argument, in fact, perhaps it raises his stature, and he's allowed to take on the president one-on-one. He's able to basically bypass the Democratic primary. You could make the case in that particular argument that it's actually good news for him.
Did he need to come out to impeach the president?
I think if you look at the candidate who has been rising in Democratic polls, Elizabeth Warren, she was one of the first to do so long before the Ukraine stuff ever hit the fan. And so, look, that's where the Democratic base was. And more than that, if you're making the argument that I'm the one who could take Trump on, and then all of a sudden Trump is throwing all this stuff at you and saying things about your family, and you're not really responding with what is seen as force, then yeah, I do think you needed to respond.
Was he slow to respond?
If you believe the numbers and where the Democratic base was, I think you can make the argument that he was. But this is a Democratic base that I think is forgiving and wants him to get to the right position.
Yeah, they'll be there when he needs them, if he gets to that point. So we're looking ahead a little bit to New Hampshire, to Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada and South Carolina and all the rest that we're going to be up to our eyeballs in not too distant future. What are you seeing as the candidate who might be the biggest surprise coming out of Iowa, assuming that it is, a Biden, it's a Warren, they're doing okay. Who else in the pack do you think could?
It's got to be Buttigieg, right?
Okay.
I mean, it's got to be Buttigieg, and the reason you got to think Iowa, New Hampshire is he does very well with white voters, and if you look at his very favorable rating in Iowa, it's the second best in the field, and that historically has correlated quite well with future strength. So Buttigieg is the candidate that I would look for if you're essentially, three's a crowd. He's the third one that I would be looking for, especially given that Sanders, especially in Iowa, seems to have fallen back significantly.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And you are always watching these numbers. What should our listeners really zone in on and look into when we're looking at the barrage of polling numbers that are going to be headed our way in the next few months?
I'll tell you a few things. Number one, don't get too smart. Don't think that you necessarily know more than that poll is saying. And, there's this big belief, so-and-so X candidate is 7 points better than they were a month ago and 14 points better than they were 2 months ago, so that momentum will carry through. Not necessarily the case. We've seen that not happen. If I were to look essentially at one number, in terms of understanding this race, it would probably be that very favorable rating. It just is the number that correlated so well with Donald Trump's support. In a primary, being liked is good. Being loved is great.
Well, you're both liked and loved at Marist College.
Wasn't that sweet?
Yes, is it indeed. Thank you so much for coming up. Let's go over to have dinner with the students and enjoy the seminar that's going to happen. Thank you so much, Harry. Appreciate it.
Shalom, be well.
And that'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub. But before we go, we want to let you know about our new Marist Poll Academy. We've talked a little bit about it, but it's an online learning portal and tool that helps you better understand what polling's all about. We talk a lot about it on this podcast, but this is a way for you to jump online, and it's a really visual and quick and fast and, did I say free? Free way for you to learn a lot more about polling in a really good way. It's at academy.maristpoll.marist.edu. It's in the show notes, so you can find it there. And we invite you to register and to join. Again, it's free.
Is it free?
It's free. How could you not love it?
I don't know.
And you can also see the cast of characters there, including
the animated
our wonderful.
cast of characters.
Well, there are lots of animations, but we actually got pretty much everybody in front of the camera.
That's true.
And we'll continue to do so, including Mary Griffith, our executive producer, who always does a great job in herding cats, and Casey Schaff, who is our editor. And of course, as we all know, Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. And we always want to thank the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University, who provides us with the ability to look back in time at survey questions and results over the decades, which we actually did on this poll too.
That's true. And we also want you to reach out to us on social media. We are found at the Marist Poll on Twitter, on the Marist Poll on Facebook, and Jay, what else? Don't forget to subscribe.